everyone, it's Janice, host of the Divorcing Religion podcast. Thanks for tuning into my show, whether you're joining me on audio or video. I've heard from some folks recently who have told me just how much the show has meant, and some of them have even found it not only to be life-changing, but life-saving, as they felt there was no one else who understood what they were going through, and they found the Divorcing Religion podcast, and they started feeling encouraged. Please help me keep my show on the air. Become a member by clicking the join button on the Conference on Religious Trauma YouTube channel. Thanks. Hey everyone, welcome to the Divorcing Religion podcast. I'm your host, Janice Selby. I'm a registered professional counselor and a religious trauma recovery coach. My guest today is LYN SMITH GREGORY. LYN grew up in Utah as one of 9 children in a devout Mormon family, and her great-great-uncle was Joseph Smith, the founder of the Mormon Church. At age 19, LYN left the church and moved to New York City, eventually obtaining an MBA at NYU. After a 20-year career in the tech industry, she left to pursue writing full-time and has attended the Iowa Summer Writing Program and the Bread Loaf Writers Conference. Now, LYN lives in Savannah with her husband. Welcome, LYN. It's so nice to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
I've interviewed other folks who have left Mormonism, but I have never interviewed someone who was a direct descendant of Joseph Smith. So I'm really curious about that, about what it was like for you growing up in a devout Mormon household and with that significant connection, because I know Mormons feel that it's really important to be able to trace back their lineage. That's like maybe a bigger deal in that group almost than any other group. It's really a big deal. So please tell us about that. What was it like growing up?
Yes, you're absolutely right. It's one of the few ways to be exalted, I guess, in the Mormon Church is if you can trace your lineage back to prominent Mormon prophets or leaders. And it's remarkable how much part of my identity this was for me. I remember when people found out, they were envious. Mormon friends were envious. Oh, wow. And it felt a little bit like living in a glass house because we were my father let us know in certain terms that we were an example that people were going to follow, and we needed to lead exemplary lives, i.e., be perfect, or at least look perfect. And that's something that I really bought into. So growing up, it was like being a regular Mormon, except maybe a little bit on steroids. We knew my father he was even more special because he was the one who had the bloodline connection to Joseph Smith, and my great-great-grandfather, Samuel Smith, was Joseph's younger brother, and he was the first convert to the Mormon Church. And the first missionary that started the whole massive proselytizing project that Mormons are still engaged in to this day. So we had big shoes to fill, and my father let us know that that's what Smiths did. And so it was quite unexpected for them and for me to discover at 19 that I didn't believe the church was true. And how that came about was I had graduated a year early from high school and missed the deadline to apply to BYU, which is the college of choice for Mormons. And so I thought I'd just spend a year at a state school and went away. And there I encountered a creative writing professor who I discovered was an atheist. Well, I adored him, and he found out I was a Mormon and a true believer, and he challenged me to defend my faith and to take his Bible as literature class next semester. So I welcomed the challenge. I wasn't really nervous about it, even though I had high regard for him. I felt so confident about my testimony of the gospel and how true it was. All I needed to do was to have the right facts at my fingertips to convince him otherwise. And I spent the week between the semesters in the library, and I had sent off for books because I wanted to read books that he would have read that had been forbidden for Mormons to read.
And this was before the internet?
This was before the internet. So I had to actually request the books to be sent to the library. And I did. And the librarian's looking at me quite askance. And, but I told her, oh no, I'm defending the faith. And so I started reading, and I started with Fawn Brody's book, No Man Knows My History, which is one of the definitive biographies about Joseph Smith. And I remember the sinking feeling in my stomach as I turned the pages, and this was not garbage. This was facts that I was learning about for the first time that differed substantially from the narrative that I had learned all my life as a child. I mean, Joseph Smith was considered next to Jesus as in terms of a saint. And I find out instead that he's a fraud, a con artist, had been digging for gold and was arrested as his neighbors accused him of fraud, claiming that he could find buried treasure. And this led to his quote unquote discovery of the Book of Mormon, which no one ever saw these golden plates that he discovered, and claimed were the records written by an ancient civilization that were the precursors to the Native American nations today. And they were two of the lost 12 tribes of Israel. And so I saw the connection and the context and the fact that Joseph Smith's family believed in visions and magic, folklore. And all of a sudden, his crazy ideas about being visited by God and Jesus and told that none of the churches were true, but he needed to start another church that would restore the authentic gospel of Jesus Christ to the earth.
Wow.
And and then there were so many incidences where he denied he was practicing polygamy. But in fact, during a very short period of time after he claimed he had a revelation about polygamous marriage, he married 41 wives, and some of them were women who were already married to friends of his, and also young girls. Here's a man in his mid-30s, and he is marrying girls 14 years old, and also manipulating, using religion to prey on them and tell them that God had decided this was what was necessary for them to do to achieve full exaltation in heaven. And I I just got sick to my stomach. I
Mhm.
just was devastated. And the facts kept piling up, one after the next after the next. The narrative the Mormon Church talks about is that the Mormons were persecuted because they were growing and prosperous. But in fact, it was because they were practicing polygamy, and which Joseph Smith denied he was doing, even while he was doing it. And he was eventually murdered by a mob who broke into the jail where he was being held for his own protection for burning down a printing press that had printed facts about polygamy, name names, et cetera, et cetera. And so all of this just came as a huge shock to me. And it was devastating. I had not intended to find this out. And I didn't know really what to do with the information other than once you see something, you can't unsee it.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew I didn't believe anymore. It wasn't like I decided that I made a decision. I just didn't.
Wow. Wow. When you mention about his family and how they had kind of been magical thinkers, right? They believed in all these different things. That is something that can really set the stage. It makes us extremely vulnerable to anybody who comes along and claims, I am a prophet, I'm a guru, I'm an exalted teacher, I have the gift of speaking to God and hearing directly from God. And I feel like no one is more vulnerable than that to that than women, because it's often the prophet saying, and you are to be my wife, or you are to sleep with me, or whatever it is. And so, because when you first mentioned that his brother was the first convert, I was like, well, how did that happen? But that explains it. If they were raised in a tradition of believing in these magical things, then his brother could have convinced him. So can you clarify for me, did Joseph Smith burn down the shop with the printing press that was
Yes.
okay? And so
It
then
was
he was in
on
jail for his
Joseph
own.
Smith's orders. Yes.
Wow.
In Nauvoo, Illinois, which is where the Mormons were at that point. And the narrative that I understood growing up, which the Mormon Church has now changed, was that polygamy started with Brigham Young, and Brigham Young was the successor to Joseph Smith, who led the Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, out to Utah, and where they were quite isolated and could practice their polygamy and other unique forms of the religion in relative peace.
Wow. So that was part of the impetus in moving to Utah, was so that they could practice some of these more harmful elements. Certainly, at least elements that other people at the time, people who consider themselves good, devout Christians, didn't support, such as polygamy. And when we talk about marrying, I have my air quotes, marrying girls who are 14 years old, like that's just unacceptable, because you're not an adult at that point. You don't have the ability to make this choice for yourself. So then you were fully indoctrinated. You grew up hearing whatever the Mormon Church was teaching at the time, and whatever your family was also instructing you with at the time. And you had no intention, when you went away to school, of unraveling your own faith. And really, you had a very good meaning in your heart when you set out to kind of show your professor the light. And then you just started getting that sinking feeling. What made you believe the book rather than the Book of Mormon, the things that you had read? What made you think that, oh, well, this author actually is speaking factually?
Well, a lot of things. For example, the Book of Mormon refers to horses and chariots and elephants, and none of those things existed on this continent. The wheel was not part of the discoveries of this civilization, and let alone chariots, and it was just the compounding of one thing after the next. I found out what the roots of the Book of Mormon were based on. And that was a story that was quite popular about the Native Americans being the lost tribes of Israel. And Joseph Smith stole a lot of his ideas about the Book of Mormon from this other book. And it's when you start to see them side by side, the contrast, it's just too compelling. It's impossible to resist what is in front of you as being factual. And the last part was, I remember the breaking point was when supposedly the secret ceremonies and covenants that take place in the temple, where non-Mormons are not allowed, are based on King Solomon's temple rituals. But in fact, Joseph Smith had become a Mason quite recently, before he came up with these ceremonies, and basically copied the Masons' hand signals, gestures, rituals, and ceremonies.
Wow.
And I was just like, for some reason, that was the final straw. And I was just like, and I just curled up in a ball in the library and silently sobbed. I did not know what to do with myself. I couldn't
That's my question. What do you do at 19 years old? This is the only truth, got my air quotes going, that you've ever known. And then suddenly it's dissolving right in front of you as you're in that library. So you
felt like
to a ball, and yes.
Uh-huh. And I couldn't imagine my life outside of the Mormon Church. I couldn't imagine telling my family I didn't believe. So I didn't for a little while, but when I stopped going to church, the church came looking for me, and I confessed to the visiting teachers who came to check on me that I was no longer a believer. And they were shocked, appalled, tried to talk me back into it. They said I'd been led astray by Satan. But ultimately, when I stood firm, I knew they were going to contact my parents. And so I had to reach out to my parents and tell them. And that was really one of the hardest conversations I've ever had.
Was that over the phone or by letter?
It was over the phone because I didn't have time. I wasn't sure a letter would get there before the church reached out to them. So my mother was devastated. I mean, in her mind, I was making rash decisions that jeopardized my eternal salvation forever. And I was going to be in utter darkness. And now the whole family was not going to be together as a unit in heaven.
Yeah.
And so I knew it was incredibly painful for her. And my father who, in a way, I was a little bit like the golden child in my family. Very, um, things went well for me easily, and I was held up by my father as an example to emulate. Like, this is how God blesses you if you are obedient and faithful and work hard. And he was so disappointed in me. And I felt like I had overnight lost the respect of my parents and my younger brothers and sisters. I was third to the oldest, and I was often, like I said, someone that they came to for advice and counsel because of my high standing in the family. And suddenly I was persona non grata. I was worse than that. I was contaminated. I had been led astray and was no longer someone to listen to. And it hurt that nobody asked me, well, what did you discover that made you decide to leave? They didn't want to know. It didn't matter to them. I had made the wrong decision. And so my reasons for leaving were unimportant. And there were often assumptions made by my family and friends, Mormon friends, that I had just not wanted to live up to the high standards that of Mormonism, or that I wanted, I had been led astray by bad fellows or whatever. And so I felt terribly alone. And I knew there was not going to be a place for me in Utah. And I wasn't even sure exactly. I didn't feel like I belonged in my family anymore. And so when I graduated from college, I moved to New York City, sight unseen. I mean,
were you still talking to your family after the phone call? Were you still in communication with them, or was that like the last time that you didn't go home again?
We were talking, but it was, they didn't disown me. They didn't, and the church did not excommunicate me. I think the church wouldn't have wanted the publicity of that. So, and they kept, for years and years afterwards, kept trying to tuck me back in. They would send people to my house and stuff. But it was I didn't go home again. I mean, I stayed at school. I ended up getting a second degree within the 4 years I was there. Psychology and journalism ended up being my degrees, and really as a way of avoiding being home. And I just did not know how to behave. But more important, to at least for me, was feeling like I didn't fit in, and there was nowhere I belonged in my family anymore.
Wow, that is so intensely painful. And there's no going back. Like you said, once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And I know for myself, when I lost my evangelical faith, I tried and tried to squeeze myself back into some way that I could make it make sense again.
Right.
And I couldn't. And it was so painful because then I didn't feel like I belonged inside, but I also didn't fully feel like I belonged outside, because there were still all sorts of doctrine and teachings there that I needed to pick apart on my own time and come to terms with. So I can't imagine being so young and on your own. Did you tell your professor?
Yes, at the end of the semester. Well, he realized something was going on because I was no longer defending my faith in the classroom. But um, I I think that's why I moved to New York City. I I felt like maybe that Mormonism was like a skin I could shed like a snake, and I would emerge in New York City with this shiny new identity, fully formed, and I would let go of the past. I wouldn't
Right.
be a Mormon. I'd be anonymous. Nobody knew me as being related to Joseph Smith. New York City seemed perfect. And of course, as you experienced yourself, it is not easy to leave deeply indoctrinated beliefs. It is, and I wanted to minimize them. And so intellectually, I thought I understood them. I don't believe that anymore. But every time I did something that had been even something as simple as swearing, um, I mean, I felt that flush of guilt. Oh my
Mhm.
God, I'm a horrible person. And, you know, it, um, it just takes the process of living to go through enough situations to unpack it all, deconstruct it, and understand what the impact has been on you. I
Mhm.
joined a women's consciousness raising group, and that was helpful because it helped me get in touch with my anger. These women were angry for me for having grown up in this patriarchal society where a woman was limited to being a wife and mother, and there were no women in leadership positions, and women were told to sit down, be quiet, smile, have babies. That's your contribution. And uh, in hearing them voice their anger, I realized how angry I was.
Mhm.
But it's incredible the self defense mechanisms that we have in place so that we don't get in touch with everything all at once.
Mhm.
Maybe it's because it's too overwhelming. I don't know. But it took years. And for anyone going through the process and thinks that, you know, um, it's going to be an easy out. No, I haven't found that to be the case. It wasn't for me, and it isn't for the other people I've talked to since. It takes a long time. It took a decade, really, and I went to therapy. It was before the internet, so I couldn't find support groups online, which would have come in really, really handy. I
Mhm.
wish I had found like-minded individuals who had been through similar experiences. And I didn't at the time, but I still had the support of a therapist, and I had to form new friends that those friendships took on a lot more weight, a lot more meaning, because in some way they were a substitute for the family that I had left.
Mhm.
And I was fortunate, to find a few really, really good friends.
Because you
Uh,
were super vulnerable, as we all are. When we've had the rug pulled from underneath us, we've lost our identity, we've lost our community, we've lost our entire world view. And here we are floundering, trying to catch our breath and rebuild from scratch.
yeah, I decided I was an atheist, and that if Joseph Smith was a fraud, maybe this whole idea of God was a myth as well. And I jumped into that camp, and I wanted science to be the answer. I worshiped at the altar of fact. If you can prove it, then I believe it. anything that is not scientific, I'm not interested in. And I've moved away from that very rigid position, and that's not where I operate now. But at the time, it was a way of trying to figure out, well, what is this all about? Why are we on the planet? Is there a reason, or is this just, a random bunch of molecules spinning through space that have no meaning? And I mean, it's just such a drastic change, like you said, of worldview, from the certainty of Mormon answers.
Mm-hmm.
Mormons had an answer for everything: why we
Mm-hmm.
were here, what we were here to do, what was the goal, what was going to happen afterwards. And suddenly I didn't know anything about anything. And that's hard to really wrap your brain around.
Yeah, yeah, it really is. And I will say, and folks who listen to this show likely know already that I am an atheist. And one thing that I found why it was helpful for me really becoming more scientific in my focus and learning about critical thinking, because I had never really been exposed to critical thinking, was that
Exactly.
it could protect me from the magical thinking, from just, kind of being blown around to and fro by whichever person said the latest thing, this crystal will heal you, or this, these sorts of things,
Right.
because I felt like such a vacuum there that I would gravitate. I wanted something because my relationship to God and to Jesus and to my faith had been the central tenet of my life. Everything was built around that. And I think you can relate as someone who grew up in a devout
Absolutely.
Mormon home. So then what is there when all that's gone? It was terrifying and isolating, and I didn't know anyone else who had been as devout as I had been, and who walked away and was living a happy and healthy and fulfilling life. So I imagine that was part of your journey too, because we have to come to terms. Each of us has to answer for ourselves, what is the meaning of this life?
Right. Exactly. And I can completely relate to needing something as concrete as atheism, to help make sense of the world and to not feel so vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
Like you said, uh, the last thing I wanted was to be betrayed again by something I believed in.
Yes.
And so, um, so my family and I'm in New York City. I would go home like once a year for Christmas, and that was always very fraught with tension, and I was really kind of at arm's length. And my younger brothers and sisters were now getting married, and getting married in Mormon temples.
Yeah.
I could not go
Yeah.
into. And they didn't understand why that hurt. I mean, they're like, well, I don't know why it bothers you. You're not a Mormon, so why would you want to be there? I'm like, well, families usually get to go to weddings because it's something you do in front of your closest family and friends to declare these vows. And so it was, I think that hurt as much as anything is being misunderstood and no one being curious about my experience.
Wow. So they just never even asked what made you stop believing. They just decided the devil led you astray. And
It
that
didn't
was it.
matter.
Yeah.
I was wrong. What did it matter? What the reason was? I mean, I had made a mistake. I had stepped off the ladder on the pathway, the stairway to heaven, and um, you know. So, um, you know, I met and married a man who was a recovering Catholic.
Yeah.
And that worked real well because he had gone to Catholic schools his whole life, and then really distanced himself from it, and started my own family. But I realized just I had so many questions that started coming up once I had children myself about, do I raise them with, no religion, and I just wasn't comfortable with any, and I still am not a organized religion person. I think it's really interesting that for the very first time, the group in the United States that identifies as spiritual, not religious, is as large as any one religious group, like Christians, etc. So, and that is the trend. I think people are finding that there are serious limits with organized religion in terms of its ability to meet their needs. And so it just, there was just lots of experiences that I would realize, oh, I thought I had healed this, but whoops, no, that's not quite,
Yes.
that's still painful.
Yeah.
And for example, I was in New York City and went to see the play, The Book of Mormon.
Oh, yeah. It's a great show. It's a wonderful show.
And I remember everyone around me laughing hysterically, and I'm not. And I'm going, why am I not finding this funny? And I realized that I felt like they were laughing at me. And then I realized, on some level, you are still identifying as a Mormon. And I was stunned because it had been decades, literally, since I had left the church.
Wow. And
I realized there was a part of me that they were making fun of sacred things. That was the thought that went through my mind.
Right.
And it just goes to show you, until something comes up, you don't realize it's there, waiting to be discovered and unpacked and healed.
Yes, and this is one of the hallmarks of fundamentalism in our beliefs, or extremism, radicalism, whatever you want to call it, when our identity fuses fully with that ideology. And so then whenever anyone comes to us with a question about the ideology, we can get very defensive because they're questioning about us and our identity and our beliefs, and nobody should be allowed to do that. And so when we have those strong, emotional, visceral reactions, that's really a time for us to step back, just as you did, and say, uh-oh, something's out of balance here. Why am I having these feelings in these responses? Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. It's been interesting in my family that this next generation, my Mormon brothers and sisters, are experiencing some of their children leaving the church.
Wow.
And I have to say, to their credit, that they have, most of them, one of my sisters, for example, when her son said, I don't believe it, and he was a returned missionary, she reached out to me and she said, how do I make sure he feels part of the family?
Wow.
That is not typical. That's not the typical Mormon response.
Right.
But so I give her a lot of credit. Others when their kids left, kind of said, well, they won't talk about it. Well, there's no invitation to talk about it, because if anybody says anything negative about the Mormon Church, they walk out of the room. So, how are you going to have a discussion? So but, it really varies. I'm pleased to see that the reception that some of my nephews and nieces have gotten has been better with their parents, and there's also many more people available to them as community through the internet and support groups, and just there really is a kind of a crisis in the Mormon Church, with millennials leaving the church over some of the very archaic practices and beliefs the Mormons have about homosexuality and the role of women, and that the millennials just can't stomach.
Yeah, I love young people. They are just not having it.
Yeah.
They are just over it. That you if you wanted to believe that, mom and dad and grandma and grandpa, that's fine for you. But I do not believe it. And in fact, you can't make me believe it or force me to believe it. I do think that the generations that are up and coming tend to be far more inclusive. They just straight care less about, well, okay, so you're a woman in love with a woman. That's fine. Are you a decent person? Are you a good person?
Right.
And that seems much more important than following a stringent set of rules that's also very judgmental.
Exactly.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
So then you married an ex-Catholic, a recovering Catholic, and he could relate to what it's like to be indoctrinated throughout his whole childhood and adolescence, and then deciding for himself, or coming to the conclusion that, no, I don't believe that way anymore. And the two of you got together and started having kids as well. And you had to make the choice of, how am I going to raise these kids? And then now you're still in touch with your family of origin. Are there certain boundaries that you've had to lay out, or things that you think might be helpful for other people who are walking a similar road to you?
Yes, I think it's really important to distinguish whether or not it's possible to have, whether there's an invitation to have a non-toxic relationship. If your only contact is toxic and there isn't any invitation from the other side that they would like something different, or that they miss you and would love to know how they could be closer, or they could see their grandkids or whatever. But if there is, then what we found in my family is that religion and politics are off the table. Point blank, do not discuss them. And it makes perfect sense, because there's no way to see eye to eye on it. And in fact, our frame of reference for even having the dialogue is so different. I mean, and I sense that with the polarization that some families are experiencing with politics, that's led to a lot of estrangement. But the other thing is, we've really learned to be careful about how we talk to each other, very respectfully, whether in their heart of hearts, believe it or not. Because a couple of my other brothers and sisters have left the church now, decades after I did.
Okay. I wondered about that. Yeah.
Yeah. They, we all have learned to be very respectful on both sides about, what your your path is, and that we respect whatever path that is, even if it doesn't look like ours, and that you're entitled to pursue it without overt judgment. Now, I'm sure there's a lot of judgment going on, but it's not expressed. And that's what's important. I think the single biggest thing is finding common ground. What do you have in common? What can you focus on that you both still feel like, oh, yeah, that's, and that is very, very helpful. Like when we started becoming parents, and then some of us have become grandparents, those experiences, sharing our hopes and dreams for our kids, and we realized that we are more alike than we are different.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that shift must occur from focusing on shared beliefs to shared values. Because
Right.
even though you're not a Mormon anymore, you still share some of the same values, core
Wanting to
values
be
that
a
you
good
were
person,
raised with. Yes, kindness, compassion,
trustworthy,
mercy. Yes, all those sorts of
charity.
things. Yes, yeah. And so that is such a different paradigm to view things through. And that's something I also speak with my clients about when I have a couple in working with me, and one has either become religious when they both started out not religious, or the opposite. One remains very religious and the other one no longer holds any religious beliefs at all. And in that case, it often can be really hard for the still believing spouse, because much like your mother, then they are terrified that the person is going to hell or not included in the same afterlife, these sorts of things. And then that can make parenting super, super challenging, because we can't have one parent saying to the children, mommy's bad, she doesn't believe, mommy's going to hell, this sort of thing. That's just not how healthy parenting works. So we have to make that shift from the beliefs to the values that are still shared.
I love the way you put that, the shift of beliefs to values, because once we identified that our values were very similar, a lot of the tension and frustration went away, because we realized that, hey, we've got a lot in common here, and so we can figure this out.
Yes. Yeah, I love that. That's so true. And one thing I do recommend for clients who have transitioned out of religion, they're no longer religious. I think it can be super helpful to do values clarification work, to figure out, take a look at, here were my values previously, the values that my parents insisted I have and my religious community insisted I have. I didn't really get a chance to decide if it was yay or nay. That's right. And now here I am, a fully autonomous adult human being. What are my values now? And that can also be important when we're maybe reevaluating career choices. Maybe someone was actually a pastor or a priest or a minister and they've lost their faith. Now, what field will they be drawn into? That's when it's also really helpful for us to become aware, do some exploration around our own values and what they are today.
What's important. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And especially, like you said, in such a polarized time. So I love your idea of religion and politics. Those kind of have to be off the table. If we're going to be spending time together and we want it to be fruitful, enjoyable, engaging time. Yes, that's right. Where we are voting for connection rather than disconnection, then we are going to focus on the things that connect us. And that is possible. You can do that, but both parties have to agree to the rules of engagement there.
Absolutely. That's why I say it's important to, maybe even have some professional help to look at and evaluate the situation and see whether or not there's a possibility for that kind of dialogue to take place, and not set yourself up for continual hurt or toxic respondents,
Right.
toxic response.
So we have to get to a point where we are able to accept reality, so that the person is this way. If I keep going to them and keep offering them, keep putting out the olive branch, and trying and trying and trying, and they consistently rebuff my efforts, at some point you're allowed to release and relieve yourself from that sense of obligation and duty to try and maintain that relationship. You can't control how another person is going to behave. You just can't. And if they're not there yet, they're not there yet. And you're allowed to just let them go.
And experience the grief that comes with letting go, and the sadness of recognizing that, at least for the time being, this is not possible.
Right. Yes. And for the situations, the relationships where it is possible, it's because people are able to choose the relationship over the religion. And that's so powerful. And I know so many people in fundamentalist situations, they can't do that. They can't bring themselves to do it because they feel like their own salvation, like a air quotes going, is on the line if they do that. And so they are willing to cut ties with people. Yeah. It's very difficult.
Very painful. Very painful to see.
So what would you say then to a 19-year-old person today who is just kind of awoken to the fact that how their family indoctrinated them, that particular set of beliefs, no longer holds water for them, and they are kind of in this state of almost a state of free fall? What would you recommend is something that's helpful?
I think finding support, individual therapy, group therapy, a support group, all of them, not just one, but you really need a lot of support for this process to really heal. And so I would recommend that. I would recommend taking your time and being very gentle and compassionate with yourself about your progress. This takes time. So don't expect miracles overnight. I used to be so upset that I would have this knee-jerk reaction of guilt or shame when I did something that I intellectually understood I didn't believe, but I've got that visceral reaction to it. And it just takes time. So gentle, breathe, give yourself permission to have all of your feelings, whatever it is that you're feeling right now, that's okay. And, if you've got, if you're estranged from family, find your family outside your family, the friends who become the kind of support people that you wish your family could be for you.
Yes.
And invest in those relationships.
Yes, right. And be aware that we can unknowingly be repeating patterns, dynamics from our family of origin. Sometimes we do it over and over again, hoping for a different outcome. So recognizing patterns so that we can change those patterns. And that takes awareness, and often working with therapists, like you said. I'll put in a plug for my own support group every Tuesday night at 5:00 Pacific. I have a free online support group for people recovering from religious trauma and religious trauma syndrome, people from a variety of backgrounds. We need a safe space to be able to come together and talk about some of the hardships as well as some of the victories on our journey of self-discovery, because that's what it is. We're learning more and more about ourselves.
Right.
This has been such a pleasure talking with you, and you've written a book.
Yes, my book, my story is about, leaving the faith with the kind of background in the Mormon Church and the legacy that I had, and my journey out and what I discovered and kind of what I believe now. And it's called We Were Smiths, and the subtitle is Escaping the Shadow of Joseph Smith's Mormon Legacy.
Wow.
And I have a website where it's just LYN SMITH GREGORY. LYN is with one N, not two. LYNSmithGregory.com. And it has blog posts where I talk about issues that I think are tangential to Mormonism and leaving a high control, high demand religion. And things that a lot of it's about Mormons, but it's also about family estrangement and depression, how we internalize religious trauma, and what that looks like and how you break free of it. But
wow, important topics. And I know you're on Instagram as well, LYN SMITH GREGORY, and Facebook, lyn.s.gregory.
It's LYN SMITH GREGORY.
Oh, perfect. Okay,
Yeah,
wonderful.
They're both the same. And I'm my website will have access to my blogs, and also I've been a guest on several podcasts, hosts who've been generous enough to have me on, and I'll post those as well.
Delightful. Well, thank you so much for sharing your story with us on the Divorcing Religion podcast.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.
I'm so glad. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in, and I'll see you again soon. Take care.